QueuePool limit of size 20 overflow 0 reached, connection timed out. The pool isn't too small, it's a leak. A plain function dependencies finally block never runs when the root raises an HTTP exception. Let's break down FastAPI Dependency Injection, how and why to use it, how it works, and the exact mistake behind that failure. Dependency injection is a pattern where a component declares its dependencies, and a framework provides them. In FastAPI, you define dependencies as callable functions, and the framework resolves them at request time. This keeps your root handlers clean and focused on business logic. A basic dependency is just a function that takes parameters and returns a value. By wrapping it in depends, FastAPI treats its parameters as if they were declared on the endpoint. This is perfect for shared logic like pagination. Here's the code. The common Params function defines two query parameters with validation. We create a type alias pagination params using Annotated for readability. Then any endpoint can use it. The parameters appear in OpenAPI docs automatically. Authentication dependencies act as gatekeepers. By raising an HTTP exception inside the dependency, the request never reaches the root. Return an identity object so the root knows who is calling. Apply Auth at the router level to make it structural. Here's the Auth dependency. It validates the TheCodeForge token header and returns an authenticated user object. The router-level dependencies list ensures every root in that router requires authentication. No per-root annotation needed. For database sessions, you must use the yield pattern. Code before yield runs during setup, and code in the finally block runs after the response is sent, even if an exception occurs. Plain function dependencies do not get this guarantee. Here's the correct pattern. The getDB function yields the session, and the finally block ensures it's closed. The accept block rolls back any uncommitted transaction. Use DB session type alias for readability. Sub-dependencies let you build a chain of logic. For example, token extraction depends on the header, user lookup depends on the token, and admin check depends on the user. FastAPI resolves them in order and caches results. Here's a 3-level sub-dependency chain. Extract token gets the token, getCurrentUser validates it and returns a user, and requireAdmin checks the role. The endpoint only declares requireAdmin, and FastAPI resolves the rest. FastAPI makes testing easy with dependency overrides. You replace a dependency with a stub and a dict, and the TestClient uses it. No mocking framework needed. Here's how to set up dependency overrides in a test. The fixture sets the overrides before the test and clears them after. The TestClient uses the stubs automatically. This is the same issue we highlighted at the start. Here's exactly why that happened. The getDB dependency was a plain function with a try-finally block. When a root raised an HTTP exception, e.g., validation error, FastAPI intercepted it before the finally block could close the session. Each failed request leaked one connection, and with a pool of 20, exhaustion happened in seconds. A plain function dependency with try finally leaks connections on HTTP exception, because FastAPI intercepts the exception before the finally block runs, leaving sessions open until the pool exhausts. The fix was to convert getDB to a yield dependency. Now FastAPI holds the generator open and resumes it after the response is sent, guaranteeing the finally block runs. We also added a Prometheus metric to monitor pool utilization and alert at 80%. This is the most common FastAPI production bug. When the root raises an HTTP exception, FastAPI intercepts it before the finally block runs. The session is never closed and connections leak. Always use yield. This is the exact code that caused the incident. The return statement means the function is not a generator, so FastAPI cannot resume it after the root. The finally block does not run on exceptions, leading to connection leaks. When auth is applied per root, it's easy to forget the depends on a new endpoint. That endpoint becomes publicly accessible. Router-level dependencies make this impossible. If a sub-dependency performs blocking I/O, it stalls the event loop. Use async dependencies for I/O bound work to avoid blocking other requests. If you set the override after creating the test client, it may not take effect for the first request. Always set overrides before instantiation. The article uses annotated Python 3.9+ for type hints. In FastAPI versions before 0.95.0, depends was used directly as a default value, e.g., params, dict equals depends common params. The annotated pattern is preferred from FastAPI plus and requires Python 3.9+. If you're on an older FastAPI, stick with the default value syntax. The article mentions caching, but doesn't show use cache equals false. This snippet demonstrates a dependency that must run independently each time it's referenced, such as generating a unique request ID. Without use cache equals false, the same ID would be shared across all sub-dependencies. When using app dependency overrides, ensure overrides are set before the test client is instantiated. If the client triggers startup events that call dependencies, those calls use the original functions. Always clear overrides in a teardown to prevent cross-test contamination. To diagnose dependency issues, first check if resource-acquiring dependencies use yield. Monitor database connections to spot leaks. Add logging inside dependencies to confirm execution. For test overrides, ensure the key is the exact function object. Let's run through some common interview questions. What is FastAPI Dependency Injection? A mechanism to declare and resolve dependencies via callables and depends. How does yield differ from return in dependencies? Yield creates a generator that FastAPI resumes after the root, guaranteeing teardown. How do you override dependencies in tests? Use app dependency overrides dict before test client instantiation. And a few frequently asked questions. Can I use classes as dependencies? Yes, classes with call work as dependencies. Does FastAPI cache dependency results? Yes, by default per request. Use cache equals false to disable. What happens if a dependency raises an exception? The request is rejected with that exception, and the root never executes. To summarize, FastAPI's dependency injection simplifies your code by moving cross-cutting concerns into reusable components. Always use yield for resources like database sessions, apply auth at the router level, and leverage dependency overrides for testing. Monitor your connection pool to catch leaks early. Ready to go deeper? Up next, FastAPI authentication, then FastAPI background tasks and async endpoints, then FastAPI database integration with SQL Alchemy. Find them all at TheCodeForge.io. Thanks for watching. The full article and code examples are covered in detail at TheCodeForge.io.